Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us again for Trial Talk Live on this rainy Tuesday. As you're probably, if you've joined us before, you know that you can type questions, into the chat for our speaker to answer at the end. My name is Nancy McDonald. I'm the moderator for today. Cynthia Anderson will be taking care of asking those questions from the chat. She's our buddy. And I'm very pleased today to welcome Catherine Disley, fourth time coming to us on Trial Talk Live. And today, winter planters. So she's had much experience providing custom 4-season planters for both residential and business clients. Today, she's going to share technique and tips to inspire us to create our own winter works of art. So over to you, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And welcome to everyone with us today. The weather has turned, bringing an end to our lovely summer planters. Things don't have to come to an end just because we can't grow plants. Filling some pots, window boxes, or hanging baskets with fresh greenery will add color and life during the months ahead. A few things before I get into the tutorial. I want to cover that your container that you use must be able to withstand freeze and thaw. I'll cover that a little bit more in a couple of slides. You want to ask yourself, is the location exposed where you're putting it? Will it get precipitation on it, snow and rain? If so, make sure that any artificial arrangements in it will withstand that. There's many artificial balls and things like that, that if they get wet, the coating on them disintegrates and you're left with white styrofoam balls. So give that some thought. The other thing is, will the planter be seen from all sides? In the photo that we're looking at, it's not seen from all sides. It's placed against a wall. So we only have to focus on putting the materials in the direction that it's going to be seen. But if your location is one where it's seen from 3 sides or even all the sides, make sure that you're adding some materials at the back so that you don't have bare spots. Create your container in scale and proportion to the surroundings. What this means is stand back, take a look at your spot, and make your container to suit that spot. If you're designing something on a balcony, it's certainly going to be a smaller scale than something that's needed for a larger home. On the front porch, for instance, you want to make sure that you're building something big enough to be seen. And a design principle that you can follow is to make your design 2/3 the height of the doorway, for instance. So if the average doorway or door is 7 feet, 2/3 of that is about 4.5 feet tall. Now, some of you are going to be saying, oh my gosh, she wants me to make an arrangement that's almost 5 feet tall to go beside my door. That's crazy. Well, you don't have to fill it all with the evergreens 5 feet up. But as you see in this design, you have branches coming up the top. So the branches can be going up to get your height. Most containers, or many containers, let me say, that I see are not big enough for the area that they're placed. And this is particularly so if people have purchased a mass-produced container sold at a big box or a grocery store. Their design principles when they're making those containers is how many can they make to fit on a transport truck? So they're designed to fit on the shelves of the rolling carts that go onto the transport trucks. So of course they're not large enough in height to be at the average entryway. So give that some thought. So the supplies and tools that you need are fairly straightforward. I like to have a bucket close by so that when I cut off any branches or leaves, excuse me, they go straight into the bucket, and then I can dump that easily into my compost. You will need pruning shears. You may also use a sharp knife if you have one. You want to wear gloves because there's a lot of sap on these evergreens and it does get on your hands. The sap will also get on your clothing. So wear your gardening clothing, Do not wear a good coat when you're doing this because the sap is very difficult to get off of your clothing. You may also need some twine or ties, and that's going to be used at the end of the presentation. If we need to be tying on any cones, we're going to use those items to do so. So here are some local evergreens that are easily sourced. You may have access to a forest, or you have a property that has some of these greenery growing on it. So the items that we're going to be using in the design that we're showing today is balsam fir. And the thing with the fir is that the bottom side of the plant has a nice bluey tinge to it. So I often turn it upside down to use that side because I'm getting a nice contrast compared to my other greenery. You don't necessarily want all of your greenery to have the same hue to it. So balsam fir can turn upside down. Hemlock is another one where the back side of the hemlock has a beautiful color to it. So take a look at your material and don't be shy to flip it over and use it, perhaps not the way that it was actually grown. The next photo is showing white cedar, which is very readily available. And then we have the white pine, and then we have spruce. So if you do not have access to collecting the materials yourself, you can purchase them. You can purchase through a flower shop, but also big box stores and grocery stores. There's no problem finding these materials. Any independent grocers, Loblaws, superstores, all of these places have been selling the fresh greenery for many years now. And it's usually available middle of November, if not sooner. If you do buy it early, I would suggest that you cut it, put it in a bucket of warm water and let it hydrate, because these foliages, when they've been purchased, have been cut several weeks ago. So try to hydrate them a little bit before you go to use them. Oops, that's going the wrong way. The other thing we're going to use is branches. I'm going to be using red twig dogwood in my design that we're demonstrating. It's easily purchased in bunches, but it's also very easy to find. Many of you will probably have red twig dogwood bushes growing on your property, and you can easily clip off some branches. When you trim or cut out a branch from the dogwood, it doesn't harm it. It actually produces twice as much growth coming for the next season. It's also easily found growing along many rural roadsides, that if you take a drive and you cut from the ditch, you do not have to worry that you're doing something illegal. All of these ditches need to be maintained to keep them clear for the water flowing through them. And most municipalities go through every couple of years and they dig everything out with a shovel. So you are not doing anything destructive in cutting a few red twig dog branches from a rural roadside. The other type of willow, or a willow that you can use, is curly willow. Some people have that growing on your property, but it's available at florists and big box. And that's a nice addition, often to a more contemporary design. And birch is often very popular. People like to use it for the color of the nice white bark. So here's some materials that are optional for your making your arrangement. Natural berries, which the ones shown here is Ilex verticulata. That's a native shrub. I have some growing on my property and the surrounding areas. So you can cut a few branches, or it can be purchased as well. The Ilex that you purchase is usually a product that's grown for the cut flower market, and it has very dense amount of berries on it. Make note that Ilex, it's a member of the holly family, and all parts of the plant are poisonous. And be aware of this with children and pets, that if they put the berries in their mouth, they have the potential to cause a problem. The greenery in the middle is southern magnolia. And I like to use some Southern Magnolia because it's just got such a beautiful color and texture that goes with it. You've got the top side that's the beautiful dark green, and the underside is a beautiful suede chestnut color. It's not an inexpensive product, but you do not need very many stems in an arrangement to give a real punch to your arrangement. So again, big box stores and flower shops have Southern Magnolia. The other things that are, again, optional are if you wanted to put any ornaments or decorations in, or adding pine cones. The cones, the sugar cones are really large cones, and they're nice if you've got a large arrangement because they're the right scale for that arrangement. And then there's the Norway spruce cones, or say white pine cones are also a fairly large native cone that can be found. They're not as large as you might like. So I would suggest that you group 3 to 5 cones together in a bunch so that you're getting enough impact from your cones. You're not just sticking them in individually. So here's more on containers. Do not use clay containers or fiberglass containers because they will not withstand the freeze and thaw that you're going to get in the winter months. If any of you have watched any of my previous presentations on containers, you may remember that I discourage people from growing plants in cast iron urns, but this is the ideal place for a cast iron urn to be used. For one thing, your urn is already 2 or 3 feet tall. So when we go back to that design principle of being 2/3 the height of your doorway, your urn is already providing some of that height. They are also very heavy, and you don't have to worry about them blowing over in the winter winds that we will get. So, but if you have a polyethylene pot, which is a heavy duty type of plastic, or even just an inexpensive plastic pot, you can use that too. I like to use potting soil or sand if you can't find potting soil at this time of year. I would discourage you from using the floral foam, also called Oasis. It is not a biodegradable product, and it just ends up in the landfill. So what you want to do to make sure that when it comes time to create your container, that your soil is not like this pot, for instance, has had the summer plants taken out of it. Well, if I just left that and we got some freezing cold temperatures coming before I go to make my planter in mid-November, the soil is going to be rock hard and you cannot work with it. So as a precaution, I would suggest that you take about 8 to 10 inches of the soil out now while it's not frozen, and you store that in a location that's not freezing, a heated garage or your basement. And then when you go to build your container, you take that out, you add it to your pot, and you're good to go. If for some reason you don't have potting soil, like I said, you can use sand for that purpose as well. So here we go. We're starting on the tutorial of how the arrangement is built. And this is one way. Of course, there's many different ways to build an arrangement, but I like to start by inserting the materials. You're going to insert your materials one type at a time. So start with your branches for the height. Remember, try to go big to start with, 2/3. You can always stand back later and cut them shorter if you really think they're too tall. But if you go with a short stem to start with, you can't make it longer. So go for the height, put your branches in, and then in this arrangement, my next step was to insert the spruce branches, and that I'm outlining the form of my design with that. Now, when you insert your stems, if there are small needles and little branches coming off the stem that's going to go into the soil, this is where you need to strip the stems. So you can either do this with a gloved hand and just slide your hand down it, and all those needles will go into your bucket. because you want a nice clean stem when you go to insert it into your soil. If you left those on, it's almost like a wedge going in, and it makes a big indentation in the soil. And then you're running the risk that your branches are going to be blowing around and not be securely anchored in the soil. The next step after we added the spruce is to put the pine, the white pine in. And the photo on the right, I'm showing that the pine, as one example, many of the greenery will have a form to it. So note the form that the branch is growing at and use that, the way that is growing, to your advantage in your design. Don't try to use a branch that's, nicely hanging to one side as something growing up the center, because it's just going to look awkward. And just as a point, when you are sort of setting out your greenery, look for any branches that might be a nice straight one and say, okay, I'm going to make note of that, and I'm going to use that in the center of my arrangement, because that's where I want something straight. Whereas a little bit coming out the center and definitely around the sides, it's nice to have something hanging down. The next step would be to add the cedar or any other greenery that you're using. You're building it up. And then as we get towards the end of the planter, this is if you're going to be using the magnolia or the ilex, you want to give it prominence. As I said, these materials have a cost to them, so you want to use them to the best advantage. So by putting them in at the end, I'm not hiding any of the leaves with greenery being added on top of it. The same thing with the ilex. Group it up high where you're going to see it prominently. And here is where I didn't add any extra materials in these materials, but if you wanted to, this is the stage at the very end that you add those materials again. So you're giving them prominence and you're filling any gaps that you might see there. So the large sugar cones that I had mentioned earlier, sometimes when you buy them, they are already on a stem. That makes it easy. You just insert them. But if they're not, or the cones that you collect in nature, they're not on stems that you can stick in. So just take some branches, some cut off branches, and tie them on using twine or twist ties, and then you can insert them. So your final step after you've put all your greenery and any additions that you want to put in it is to water the planter. By putting on a nice supply of water, it's going to allow the soil to settle around those stems. It's going to freeze, and this will actually, before you get to the freezing stage, that moist soil is going to hydrate the foliage through the winter. By freezing, it then locks the stems in place so things aren't going to blow out. And they're going to last through the season. So the design that we worked on through the steps is a little bit similar to this one that's shown in the picture. It's more of a traditional design where the materials are placed rather similarly spaced throughout the design, and that gives you a traditional looking design. But you might have a contemporary home where you want to go with a contemporary looking arrangement. So to make a contemporary looking arrangement, you can make dense groupings of a few materials. So here you can see that they've got all of the dogwood, in very strong bunches, and then they've put some ilex in, again, all in very defined groupings. And it gives a nice, more contemporary look. Another way to do a contemporary design is to use a very minimal amount of materials, group the materials together, or use multiple containers, 2 or 3 containers grouped together, or even more, depending on the location that you're putting it in, is going to give you a contemporary design. So I hope you've been inspired to create something for your own porch or balcony. And I'd like you to be able to share your creation with us. So one way that you can do that is through our Master Gardeners of Ottawa-Carleton Facebook group. That's a great way because then not only I can see it, but other people can see it and be inspired by what you've done. Or if you're not a Facebook user, you could send it to the email that you got the notification for this talk from, the Magog TTL at gmail.com. And now, if we have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Catherine. I was just going to ask you, I've done wreath making in previous past. And what I've used is, I don't know if you've tried this, is I live in an area where there's lots of apple trees, and I've taken branches of crab apples and used them in an arrangement. So I've done that years ago. And have you ever experimented with that?
Sure. At this time of year, you can see often, especially the small crab apples that are persistent on the trees, they hang on there and they provide nice color. And those are a good option to be using to give you that punch of color. They will last for a certain amount of time, but once they freeze and then we might get another thaw, they don't last as long. It depends on the crab apple. The smaller ones certainly will last longer because they're not as fleshy and they do take the freeze and thaw. So certainly you can use that. And just to note, whether you're using crab apples or ilex or any other type of natural berry, that's what many birds eat during the winter months too. So don't be surprised if you get some feathered friends coming to your planters and having a little snack from those berries.
I noted on one of your slides, just near the end under the contemporary design, you had a beautiful arrangement there. I saw some large stalks. Was that colored corn stalks? I'm not sure. I couldn't tell what it was.
It was a dried material. Let's see if I can go back to it. That one there. Yeah, that's a dried material. It's a type of leaf. And I just took several of them and bound them together. Okay. And they certainly lasted, well, certainly for one season. And I think for my own porch, I actually reused those a few times, even though they were getting some of the elements on them. So as long as they're dense enough, they're going to work for using in a design.
Okay, I have a question in the chat. So how would you use birch logs in a planter? Same like the dogwood in a center? In a center? Yes, in a center, she said.
Yeah, so using birch, it's very popular, but you run the risk of when you're doing it, in my opinion, of having the birch rather look like amputated limbs that go into it. So you need to give it some, I don't know, some, what's the word I'm looking for? Something that makes it relate. Just having, 2 or 3 birch branches randomly just shoved in there, there's nothing cohesive about it. So if I was going to use some birch branches, first of all, I'd want to make sure that they're tall. Well, they could be tall. When you buy them, often I see, 3-foot birch branches being sold. And by the time you put those into an arrangement, you've stuck it in far enough, you're down to a 12-inch birch log. So try to find branches that would be long so that you're having 2 or 3 feet coming out for your planter. I would group them more at the top rather than spreading them out randomly, so that you're getting a nice impact from the birch, and then maybe adding in some other branches with it so that you're not just having, just solid birch branches, and you're making it look more like a little bit of a forest setting with more than one branch type going on there. Or another thing that you could do if they're short is you don't have to necessarily stick them in so that they, as they were growing in the ground, you could lay them horizontally, make a grouping, a bundle of them, as you might see, a bundle of firewood or something. Perhaps add some cones on top of that. So you're making a little vignette with it.
Very nice. Are you aware of any sources of blue spruce branches where a person could get those for their arrangements?
Well, like I said, all of these greenery are available at big box stores and flower shops. Or oftentimes, for instance, I saw on Facebook, somebody was saying that they were going to trim off all the lower branches from their spruce tree, and it was a beautiful blue spruce. So wouldn't it be nice if, there was somebody on your street that was pruning something and you asked, could I have the cuttings? Another source when it gets closer to the season is that places that sell Christmas trees often have greenery there because branches that are broken, or people say, could you trim off the bottom branches for me? I don't need that. So that's a source there as well.
How about making, someone's asking a question, how about making an arrangement in a large plastic pot and then just dropping them into a larger planter? What are the disadvantages?
There would be no disadvantages. Certainly you can make them in, that would be called a liner, right? You're creating your arrangement in a liner pot and then setting it into a different container. Just make sure that the container that you're using is going to be able to withstand the elements. By making it in a separate pot like that, you don't necessarily have to have your outer pot full of soil. So you won't necessarily get the freeze and thaw and expansion going on that would crack your outer pot. If you do that though, make sure, or for any of the arrangements, try to have your container be as heavy as possible. So say you were using a tall urn and you built a separate pot to go into that urn, try and fill it up with some rocks or frozen jugs of water, something that's going to make it heavy, because we often forget that the winter weather that we get includes a lot of wind. And more than once, I've had containers blow across my porch because I forgot to weigh the container down well enough. So, and in that case, some of the things can break. So make sure your containers are heavy, however you do it. Bricks, like I say, jugs of frozen water often work well, but using a liner pot is a great way to go.
What other types of container materials do you recommend for these floral arrangements besides the ones you've already mentioned?
Well, you can use just about anything that appeals to you. Perhaps you have an antique milk can and you would like to make your arrangement in that. Maybe you have some type of wooden wine barrel, half barrel, anything like that. Wood is fine, but again, just be cautious of the freeze and thaw. Perhaps you would want to use a liner and something like that. Or if you have any kind of decorative thing that's going to hold some soil so that you're able to build a container in it. I wouldn't use glass for anything like that that's fragile, because even if it didn't freeze and thaw, you do have to consider that they do have to stand up to the elements.
I have noticed in magazines and social media like Pinterest and other media that some arrangements are made with fresh flowers and product. What do you recommend?
Well, if you have a special occasion coming up, it's great that you add a real punch of color you can incorporate fresh flowers into your design that way, or pomegranates, anything really that would add a nice punch of color. The thing that you have to remember is that those items will look good until they freeze. And when they freeze, that's great, as long as they stay frozen. If they stay frozen for a month, they will last that way for a month because they're frozen. But what tends to happen in our climate is that we get days where it freezes and then we get a mild temperature and things thaw out. And once those fresh products thaw out, like flowers, for instance, then they are going to start to turn black and deteriorate. But you could at that point just cut those items out of your arrangement. Pomegranates are a little bit of an exception. They are nice to use. They're beautiful color. And they will take some freezing to a certain point, but again, they'll only take so much freezing and thawing before they're looking not so attractive. They look like thawed out fruit.
So we have one last question. Any tips for adding lights to the arrangement?
Yeah, lights are often a little tricky. So of course you want to have a light place to plug them in fairly close by so that you don't have your electrical cords going over where people are walking and there may be a tripping hazard. Try to choose lights that, say if you were using birch branches, that you use lights that have white wires on it. That way the lights are not so obvious when they're not turned on. But yeah, try to put your lights, see if you can hang them on branches. They need to be fairly significant, sturdy branches to support the lights. Or you can also, just wind your lights through the greenery. I would do that again at the stage, probably when you've got all of your greenery placed in, and before you put your finishing touches on it, add the lights at that point. Turn them on, take a look at how they look, and adjust before you get everything finished off. So yeah, lights are really nice. They can be a little bit finicky to get them looking right. And also there are some solar lights for that application that you can find as well. So take a look for those.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I've got lots of tips myself to try something new this year. Now, next week, actually, I'm hoping you will join us for our very last Master Gardener Trial Talk Live. And we have 4 very experienced expert Master Gardeners that are going to present and then answer questions. We've been looking for some questions, and I'm sure you'll have some for us. And we're planning on going a little extra time next week. So we'll start at 12:30 sharp and probably go till about 10 after 1. So that's our last roundup next week. Thank you for joining us.